All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is the last, I think, presentation before your data night out, so thank you for coming. We might start data night out earlier. My battery is dying, and I don't know, a MacBook charger. But we'll try and make it work. So today we're going to talk a bit about statistical controls at scale, and with the at scale, part of that I really mean how to evaluate numerous metrics using statistical controls at scale. So not just one SPC chart and one metric for one client, but hundreds or thousands at the same time instead. This photo here, this is my son, Holden. So he was born 7 months ago. My wife and I named him Holden, and we thought 7 months was old enough to bring him over to Vegas. So if you want to see how responsive security is at the MGM, you have to put a toddler there. I think it took about 4 seconds, and somebody was over there, and they didn't mind what the occasion was, photo or otherwise. But anyway, he's doing really well, and we had a great experience. The hospital birth was perfect, and we were quickly sent home. And in Ireland, what happens is, where I live, they send a nurse out to your home, and she checks in on Holden and sees if everything is okay, and she takes numerous different measures and tests just to make sure he's developing all right. And so one of these measures that she was taking is his weight. And so every time she would come over and check his weight and then make a note of that and then really check out what's happening. And so one day she told us in kind of a serious voice that something is up and his weight is not actually progressing the way it should be. And so she showed us this chart that shows the target weight of an infant, of a young male infant, and with age, the number of days, and then the expected weight based on his birth weight. And so she was saying something is up, he's not at the weight that I would expect him to be. And so my wife and I, like any good parent would do, would freak out. And I came home from work, my wife rang me, and I came home, and it's like, this is a big issue, and we made an appointment with our family doctor, and we went back to the nurse's station at the hospital to find out what was going on. We had blood tests taken, and they sent it off to the lab, and the doctor said that we should just go home, take it easy, and find out what's happening in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, the nurse would continue her visits, and she would come over and take his measurements and check his weight. So one day she said to us that, well, actually, he's now overweight. And so, we had this very brief moment of happiness, and then, after that, we panicked again, like, maybe he's not getting the food and the nutrients that he needs. Maybe we're giving him too much, and something is not going well. And so, really, I think this translates well into business worlds as well. So we have a target for a given measure, and we want to achieve that target. We don't want to be below it. We don't want to be above it. And I think all of us have probably been in meetings where when you're below target, it's really frustrating in the business huddles together, and we have this meeting or this action plan or a path to green or a flight plan, anything to remedy that situation and to get back to target. And similarly, if we're above target, we tend to celebrate, or even worse, we tend to ignore it. And so we spend a lot of time finding out what has gone wrong, why we're not achieving target, and we spend a lot of time ignoring what's been going well. That's typically my experience. And so this became an issue for me recently in my own job, where we produce numerous dashboards for different healthcare providers. And one of the projects that I was working on involved looking at tens of thousands of different providers in the US and in Latin America, and looking at a bunch of different KPIs. These are just some of the KPIs. It really doesn't matter which KPIs, but we had more than 50 different KPIs that we wanted to measure. So 50 KPIs, more than 10,000 providers, and some of them had targets, some of them didn't have targets. And so we were really given a pretty hard objective, as it's to evaluate all of these providers, make it easy to understand which provider is doing well, which provider is not doing well, and then as well work with providers that don't have targets for a given metric and that do have targets for other metrics, and then be able to digest those results every single day for a single person in a matter of minutes. And so that was a pretty tough task, and that's what I want to talk about today, how we kind of tackled that particular objectives. So I'll talk a bit about KPI management using targets, so that above or below situation where you either meet or don't meet target. Then a little bit about the basics of statistical process control, and so a different approach instead of using targets to use SPC charts, and then dive into how we can combine these two different worlds that typically tend to conflict. A target may not be very scientific, and an SPC approach might be very scientific, and they don't always work well together. And then we'll look a bit about creating Tableau charts or SPC charts in Tableau, and we'll look at the different signals that we can pick up there as well, and then how we can evaluate at scale, so using hundreds of different providers or thousands and dozens of different metrics at the same time. All right, so we'll start off with KPI management using targets. And every job that I've been in my own career typically starts off with observing some of the meetings and learning about the business. And what I typically see is Excel files like this really are being used. And I've worked for some really large entities, and typically this is how they manage their business. No matter if they have Tableau or some other BI tool or the most advanced services available, this is how reporting really gets done. And so on the left-hand side, we have all the different providers, and then we have a column for every single day, and then we have the actual result value. So it's accurate, all the data is there, but it's pretty hard to read and digest, and you don't know really where to focus your attention. And so an evolution of this dashboard might look something like this, and I've skipped the slide here, you might not even notice, but now we have 3 columns per day. We have a target value, we have the actual value, and then the variance, so just the difference between those two. And then again, it's useful information to have, and it's a bit more insightful, you can look at it, but it takes a lot of time to go through all of that information. And the final evolution that I've seen is conditional formatting. So green if you're meeting target, red if you don't meet target, and amber for, I'm not really sure what amber stands for, but it's usually a topic of something that we discuss aggressively in meetings. What is amber and what is it not? And so I'd like to go from that very extreme, if I go back one slide again. So from this Excel dashboard all the way to this, where we just have 3 boxes or 3 numbers and find out who's stable, we don't need to worry about, we don't need to pay attention to, who's showing early warning signs, we might look into them if we have the time, and then who needs attention right now, and this is where we need to spend our time. So it's completely the other side of the spectrum. So to do that, we'll dive into statistical process control charts first. Just a quick check, a show of hands. Has anybody used SPC charts in Tableau already? Okay, good for you. Good. All right, so we'll keep it at a high level, and I think really for today, what I want to convey is the concept of SPC charts, how you can do it in Tableau, and how you can apply that to your environment as well. There's different types of SPC charts, so I'm going to just show a very basic approach that you can do today. If you're interested, I'll share the deck, and there's some links into explaining how to really build an SPC chart from scratch. But you can YouTube as well. There's many different ways to achieve this particular type of chart in Tableau. So it doesn't have to be this way, but it's really the idea that counts. So if we look at a typical chart layout that we have here, we have the value on the y-axis, and then time on the x, and then we have 3 lines. And then the center line really here is the average in my case. So different SPC charts have different metrics or ways of determining these charts. In a simple example, it's just an average. And then we have the upper control limit, or the UCL, and that's the limit that we want to have on our performance. So if anything goes above that limit, we want to raise a warning flag, even if it's something good like revenue that you want to go up, or want to see going up. If it spikes above that line, something out of the ordinary is going on. It's statistically significant. And similarly, if it goes below the lower limit, we want to be aware of that. And so we can add some banding to it. So if we're in the green section, we're generally in a good shape. It's something we want to be. And if we're in a red section, it's something we definitely don't want to be in. Whether that's good or bad, it's something that's quite significant and we want to pay attention to. All right, so if we plot some data on this chart here, so if we evaluate the data that we see here, we can bring back the bands and we can see that everything is in the green area. And so what we call this is noise or common cause variation. So we see that the data is going up and down, and maybe if you have a target line somewhere there, it's going above target, below target. But in an SPC chart, this is called noise, and it's not significant. So there's no reason to act immediately and have that freak out moment and call a meeting to discuss what the situation is. And so if we do another example here, here's pretty obvious. We have a data point that's really spiking very high, and then we have another one that's really low, and they're clearly in the red bands. And these are what we would call signals. In these cases, are an outlier above the upper control limit or an outlier below the lower control limit. So these are events that we really do want to pay attention to. And this one's pretty easy to spot, especially in this example. So if we do another one here, if we look at the bands again, we can see that everything is in the green area. And so we previously said that this is noise, something we don't want to pay attention to. But there are a couple of exceptions. So if we look at this chart, and specifically if we highlight the last few data points that I've marked in red here, you can see something is going on here. And in this case, we can see that every subsequent data point is increasing in value. So this is another signal that we would call a trend. So even if it's in the green area and it's within control, there's something statistically significant happening. Data points don't move in a direction like that for a number of subsequent periods of time. So it's something we want to capture as well. And similarly to the trend going up, we can capture the same kind of behavior if the trend is going downward. So I'll look at one last example with you here. So again, here we can see all of the information is within that green zone, and we don't see any significant trending upwards or downwards. You might see a couple of data points at the very beginning. They are going upward, but there's a difference between numerous significant number of data points going upward or downward in one direction, or just a few. So I'll come back to that later. In this case, we just have 4 data points going in one direction. It's not significant yet, so we don't want to pay attention to that. Instead, we have a different signal, and if we look at the last few data points in red again, what we can see here is something that we call a run. So every data point is below that center line. It's below the average. And similarly, it could be above the average, and it would be a run as well. And so what we want to indicate here is that, again, something significant is happening. We expect that common cause variation, the data to go up and down along that center line, just like my son's weight might go up and down below his target weight. And so, again, this is significant, something we want to pick up. And the reason for that might be that it's something that's changing slowly over time. It's not so obvious as an outlier. It's not as obvious as a trend, but it is still a signal that some change is happening in the business. So with that last example, we think we've really covered the basics of SPC charts. We won't do a deep dive during this session in that. We'll come back to how to do that in Tableau. But I think these are the high-level takeaways that you should know about. And so we'll look at how we can combine those SPC charts with regular targets. Because you can't really go out to your business or to your stakeholders and say, well, we have this new approach. We're going to use SPC charts to evaluate performance, and we can't really use targets anymore. It's a thing of the past. It's probably not going to go down well, and in a lot of businesses, really, you have targets that you have to meet. If you're a publicly traded company, you have targets, or you have employee targets or MBOs, things like that. If you work with a customer, you might have service level agreements. So there's always that element. You can't just do away with targets. What we can do is merge the two. So I have this red line here showing a target, and it's sitting nicely in that green area between the control limits. So it looks pretty reasonable. But if you start doing this in your own line of work, you might see that that target line is completely shifted. It might be above the upper control limit. It might be below the lower control limit. Because really, targets are set in numerous different ways, and there's not always a lot of science behind it. Maybe you just want to exceed last year's results, plus 10% or something like that. So this is just a best case example where the target line is probably set reasonably. And so if we look at a couple of data points again, The question then becomes, is this good performance or bad performance? Do we want to raise attention to this point? Do we want to call it an early warning sign? Do we want to set out a reminder to look at this? And so everything is green. We're meeting target. And this is back to the spreadsheet that we saw earlier. Normally in a spreadsheet that we would see with conditional formatting, this particular KPI would be green because we're meeting target. We're actually above target, so no need to raise suspicion that anything is going on. Then if we look at the SPC signal, we can see that there's a downward trend. So maybe there is something going on. And it's great that today we're meeting target, but we see this downward trend. So maybe tomorrow we're not meeting target. So we still want to call attention to that particular event. And so if we think about it that way, where we combine all of these different things, we can really have 12 different outcomes, from the best outcome to the very worst outcome, where the best one is you have achieved your target, and you're in that green zone, and you're in control, it's going up and down. And then the worst case would be where you're not achieving target, and we have an outlier below the lower control limit. And this is assuming that a higher value is better. If you have metrics that have a lower value that is better, like attrition or return rate, something like that, you have another 12 combinations. So you end up with 24 possible different combinations. And so this is what we'll use to create the SPC charts in Tableau and to make a combination of that. So I've loaded some sample data here. It's pretty straightforward. The data table just provides me with the different provider names, or in your case, that might be employee or customer or provider as well. The name of the KPI, the date, and the result for that day. And if KPI information gives me the desired trend, whether I prefer a higher number or a lower number, that just helps me to find out which of those 12 measures to apply. And then again, we have the targets to match to the results, so we can see if we met target or not. So a preview of this data, very basic, it just looks like this. You can see here we have provider A, and we have KPI 1 and 2. And throughout this presentation, I'll just use provider ABC and KPI 1, 2, 3, just for simplicity. And then we have the result and the target. And some of the first calculations I apply is the row and the moving range. So the row is based on the combination of provider and KPI. So we can see here provider A has two KPIs, KPI 1 and 2. And so the row goes from 1 to 5. And then when we switch to KPI 2, it resets and it starts at 1 again. And this will come in handy later, so we'll come back to that. And then the same goes for moving range. We'll come back to it, but it really is just the difference between the current result and the row before that. So if we look at the first two results, we have 9 and 10. The difference between that is 1, and the next one is 9 and 11. The difference between those two is 2. Those are just some of the foundational calculations that will help determine the control limits later on. And so we'll dive into those calculated fields. Like I said, I'll make this deck available, so it's better to read up on it, and I won't go into this particular slide especially, but there's some links so you can go through some of the details if you do wish to implement it. So the next slide provides a bit of a more clear outline of this. So we have the different lines that we have. Like I said, the middle line here, the center line is just the average, and then the upper limit is that center line plus 2.66. Which is from a statistical table of constants, which on the previous slide, there's a link that explains more about that, times the average of the moving range, so the difference between each row. And so if you do implement this in your own work environment, I don't recommend you copy-paste these formulas, so it really does matter which constant you use, and make sure that it's suitable for your environment. But it's a good starting point anyway, and then you can take it from here. All right, and then I have some what I call supporting calculations. They don't really show up in any of the reporting. They're just used by the other calculated fields. So the moving range is that difference between the different rows. The latest result just gives me the latest result. So if my time frame is 10 days, the latest result is just the result for day 10. And then I have the result plus or minus row. And this calculation comes in really handy. So I'll look at the current row, and if x is minus 3, and my current row is row 5, then I get the result for row 2. And if x is 1, I'll look at row 5, I get the result for row 6. And this will come in handy when we look at trends, and we can see, do we see numerous subsequent periods going in one direction. And with those formulas, now we can ask 7 different questions of our data to really interrogate it and make sure that we find the answer that we want to have, so to find out where in those 12 different categories it falls. So again, I won't go into the calculations, but these are copy-paste pretty much, but it's really about the header. So the first question is, are we meeting target? And we're just looking at the latest result. So we're only interested in the latest result, but unlike the Excel dashboard, we're also interested in what happens before the latest result if that impacts the latest result. So if the latest result is part of a downward trend, we want to know all about the history that led up to that. So this is pretty simple. We have target achieved or target not achieved, and you can even refine this further to see if you have exactly met target or not. I don't have that here because it's not likely to happen from my data. The second question is the latest result an outlier. So is it in that red zone? Is it above the upper control limit or below the lower control limit? And again, it's pretty straightforward. The answer would be yes or no. Then, is it in statistical control? So is it noise, really? Is it just in that green area where the data goes up and down? Yes or no? Then one of the more significant signals that we want to find out is the latest result part of a downward trend. So do we see subsequent data points going in one direction, in this case going down, so the figure keeps getting smaller and smaller over time. And so in my particular case, 7 data points was enough to call significant. But if you want to implement this, you have to look at your data and how often you measure your data and make sure that you capture enough data points. So my data is daily, and 7 subsequent points was deemed significant, so I could use that. But if you measure something 100 times a second, maybe 7 data points is not enough. So just to keep that in mind. And then subsequently we have the same, but the inverse. Can we see an upward trend, yes or no? And then the last 2 questions are similar. Do we have a run below the center line? So do we see a result that's below average consistently? Again, 7 data points in a row. Or question 7, do we see that happening above the center line? And so these calculations you can just reuse. The only thing you have to change really is how far do you want to look back or how far do you want to look forward. All right, so a very basic SPC chart will look something like this. I don't know if you can see it on the big screen, but we have 3 dotted lines for these different control limits and the average line. In the middle we have the green target line, and then the line itself is the data plotted over time. So here we can easily see where does it fall, if we have any outliers, is it above or below target, is it in control, yes or no. But like I said at the beginning of this meeting, the project that I was tasked with was to do this for more than 10,000 providers and 50 metrics per provider. I don't know how many charts that amounts to, but a lot. So this was not the right way to do it. So we're going to talk a bit about how we can format the different signals in a single chart. So again, these are the same 12 outcomes we had before. So now we need to make this visible in that chart that we've just seen to find out which signal are we seeing. And I know this is probably the wrong conference to do this at, but I've changed my time series to a bar graph. You can keep it as a line chart. I think for the purposes of what I'm trying to do here, it's easier to read in this fashion. So I've just changed it to a bar graph, and then I applied the different formats to the graph. And so we can have a maximum of 12 different colors. In this simple example, we only have 5 or 6. I think you would agree it's pretty hard to read. This is not really an improvement from the Excel file. And then imagine having 12 different colors in that chart. It's great information, but it's really not going to get you anywhere. So we need to do a bit of grouping on those 12 different items that we have. And so you can group this any way you want. I've grouped it into 4 different buckets. The stable bucket, meaning this is all good, nothing specific is going on, you don't have to worry about it, really you don't have to look at this data at all. And the informed bucket really gives you signals that are relevant and significant, but you're still achieving target, and the signals in a positive direction for you. So if you have revenue, for example, and the signal is an increase in revenue, there's a significant trend that you're seeing, that's good. You don't want to raise a flag, but it would be good to inform the user regardless that something significant is happening. Even if it's a feedback loop, maybe they've implemented some improvement program and they want to see if that made a change, yes or no. Then the monitor bucket I use for early warning signs. So that's specifically where we have met target, for example, but we do see some shifts in the data that we need to be aware of. And then finally, act is where really things have gone wrong and there is a need for immediate attention, and we should freak out and have that meeting. So this is really how to bring that all together. So an example, you have a positive outlier, so revenue is spiking, you've achieved target, great, we still want to inform you of that. And then we have monitor, for example, for a negative signal. So we've achieved target, but we can see a negative signal, so a trend going downward or run below average. It's something we want to make the user aware of, that that has happened. And so if we use this table here and create a calculated field out of it, basically a big if condition, and apply that to the chart that we saw before, we can get something like this. So in this example, I'm just highlighting the most recent signal that we've seen, and if that signal is part of historical events that took place before that, I'll color those as well. So in this case, we can see a run, or a trend, I think. Sorry, no, it's a run. And so the last signal is highlighted in this chart. And so in the past, maybe some other events have taken place. Like we saw before, we had lots of different colors. But right now, we're only interested in what's happening right now. I do want to extend that a little bit, though. So I've created this calculated field that says what's the most recent signal, and then look back in the past and see, have we ever seen this signal before at any point in time? And if we apply that to the color of the chart, and then in this example, we can see that in the past, we had this exact same scenario. So it doesn't look the same on the chart because the graph is going up and down. In the beginning, it seems pretty stable, but the same scenario that is taking place there where we have met target, we see a run above the center line. And this is really to help the business evaluate what's going on. So if they do decide to look at this data and they finally end up on this SPC chart, they can see this is not the first time this has happened, and maybe they would recall what has happened in the past and apply the same remedy that they would have back then. All right, so with that, dive a bit more into how to evaluate that at scale. So we now have a better chart. We can easily read the chart. We can understand what's going on, but it's still pretty hard to read. So in my particular project, I've created 3 dashboards. I have an executive summary, which just shows the different buckets. Is it stable, inform, monitor, or do we need to act? And then we have a snapshot dashboard that really gives you all the different providers and all of the different KPIs and their status. And if the user wants to drill down, there is that SPC chart. But instead of the SPC chart being the main component, it really just drives the other dashboards. But it's not something we want to direct the user to from the start. It's only if it's really necessary. All right, so with that, I'll switch to Tableau. Looks like I have 60% battery, so we might make it. All right, so this is the executive summary that I have. And so in this example, we have just over 500 different providers. We can see that 436 ended up in the stable bucket. And so in this case, everything in that bucket we don't need to pay attention to. If it's in a monitor bucket, it's combining the inform and warning groups that we've seen before. So it's something that we want to pay attention to. Maybe something good is happening, maybe something is trending in the wrong direction, but it's something worth just flagging. And finally, we have the action bucket. So this is really something you need to pay attention to right now. Something has gone wrong and needs your attention for an immediate fix. So you can click on any of these buckets to get more data on what I call the snapshot dashboard. And what we do here is list the different providers of provider 174 and provider 3, the different KPIs at the top, and everything that doesn't have a significant signal is just grayed out. So we kind of reduce the noise. They don't need to know what's going on. And so we can just hover over any of these red ones, and then we get a summary of what's going on. So what's the actual result? Is it above or below target? And in plain English, we get the warning message there. So in this case, we've missed target, and results are trending downwards. So it's double bad, if you will. Just flip back here. So we can do the same for the monitor bucket. In this case, we get 2 colors. So if you're on the lookout for early warning signs, we'll look out for amber. So something is going on here that we want to be aware of. So in this case, we have achieved targets, but a result is running below the center line. So performance might be slowly changing over time. But we also call out everything in green. So in this one, for example, we've achieved targets and we're running above the center line. So we're trending in the right direction, hopefully, but it's something worth calling out because it's different from past results. And so from here, we can click on any of these charts. And at this point, the user has already decided that they want to do a deep dive. So hopefully they'll very rarely come to this page unless it's from the act bucket, really. And so when they're on this page, they have decided to take action and to do a deep dive. So they get some highlight figures, see how far they were off from target, what signal have we found, and in plain English, again, we list what's going on with the data and why did we flag it. And we can see all the items that are affected. And finally, we can look at the overall provider status. In this case, I've just taken the number of metrics that have a warning sign or an act sign on it and divided that by the total number of metrics. And then when we click on that, we get a page with 20 SPC charts, one for each of the different KPIs. So if one of my colleagues in the network team or the account management team will go on a call with this customer or provider, they have all the data handy, not only what's going bad, but also what's going well. They can quickly pick up the phone and go on a call with those people. But like I said, hopefully it will rarely come to it. People will stay on the act bucket and just really focus their attention there. So I'll just flip back here. Just some closing notes. I think I'm doing really well on time, so we might have time for questions. If you do want to start with this, familiarize yourself with statistical controls. So in this deck, there's a couple of links, and there's a reference to a really good book here. Like I said, there's many different ways to implement this. This is probably the most basic way you can do it, so it's a good starting point. But there are many, many more advanced ways that you can do this. Some of them are quite complex and quite intensive calculations. So if you do that, if you have Alteryx or Tableau Prep, it might be a good idea to do that before you load it into Tableau, especially if you need to find out trends. Let's say you want to find out if a trend is significant, if it happened 50 times in a row. That means for every column in your bar chart, a calculation has to be performed 50 times really in the background. And so it's pretty intensive, and you can see just now that my computer was pretty slow at handling that. So data prep would be a good one there. The second one is to define normal. So because we look at the moving range and the average, performance changes over time. So let's say you have 20 data points that are outliers in a row. The average will change. And so the control limits will change based on your data. That's not something you might necessarily want. So you might say that performance in January was ideal, and I want to base the control limits on what I've seen in January. So you can do a simple if statement that says if the dates between 1st of January and the 31st, calculate the control limit, and then use that going forward. And then finally, managing change. And for me, this was the hardest part, really, and how we ended up with this dashboard. Because previously, we just made a change to SPC charts and tried to introduce that to the business and said, this is a great way to do things, and you should do it this way. It didn't really work out well for me. So really to manage change and to help them incorporate the targets that they have today. When you do that, I found it to be that people are pretty accepting of it and they get excited about it actually. And at the end of the day, hopefully it will save them some time as well. So that went pretty well for me. So those are the three things I'd call out. The fourth one being prepare your data maybe outside of Tableau. All right. With that, please fill out the evaluation if you find this helpful or not. Reach out to me on email if you have any questions. I think we have about 20 minutes left actually for today. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take those.